Hello, I'm Cheryl Norton from Monash Mindfulness, and I'm delighted to be here today to host our Q&A session about the film My Year of Living Mindfully. I'm joined by award-winning journalist and filmmaker Shannon Harvey, who's the director of the film, and also by Craig Hassett and Richard Chambers, who coordinate mindfulness programs at Monash University and our courses on FutureLearn. Shannon, as the star and the director of the film My Year of Living Mindfully, I'd love to ask you a question that I'm sure many of the learners will be wondering. Are you still practicing mindfulness daily? And if so, how do you find the time to do this?
Good question.
Good question, especially seeing as we're all coming live from our homes in lockdown because of COVID-19. And Sherelle, I know you're a mum, so you know what it's like having young ones at home and trying to work and all of that. So the answer to your question is yes, I'm still meditating daily. I did the math the other day and I am about to have my 1,000 day anniversary, which is really astonishing, actually. As to how I find the time, well, the answer to that is that I use science. So I scoured all the behaviour change evidence to look at what do we know about what it takes in order to make healthy changes last in our lives. And despite our good intentions, and certainly my good intentions, I don't actually trust the future version of me to follow through with the intentions that I might have in this moment. So early on in the project, I made what's known in behaviour change science as an Odysseus contract, which is why I had an army of scientists tracking my every move. And if I didn't meditate every single day, then there would be nothing for the scientists to find. So it was kind of like this constant prod. These days, my practice is far more intrinsic instead of extrinsic, and I still use a behaviour change technique that was developed by a man named Peter Gollwitzer from New York University called if-then planning. And the planning goes like this. If it's 6 a.m., then I will meditate. Now, the great thing about if-then planning is that it encourages me to plan for all the obstacles that may get in my way. So, for example, this morning, my 3-year-old son came in at 6:05 for a lovely, wonderful, gorgeous snuggle. And although I did my darndest to keep practicing, by the time he started doing these ones in my eye, there was no amount of mindfulness that was going to keep me practicing. So that's when the if-then planning kicks in. So if I don't meditate at 6 a.m., then I will meditate at the first opportunity on my lunch break. And I've now kind of implemented all of these obstacles throughout, my week and throughout my day. And as a result, I've not missed a day since.
That's fantastic, Shannon. And I think that flexibility of if it doesn't work in the morning that we can do it later, that's great. And another reason to try and aim for a morning practice, because you do have the rest of the day to try and fit in an extra session there. I think the learners will be inspired by hearing that you've been able to keep that up for, over 1,000 days now daily, which is fantastic, because we hear so often, particularly from our repeat learners, that they do the course and they practice regularly while the course is on, but then they stop when the course is over, and then they come back and they do another run or the follow-up course and they practice regularly, and then it drops off again. So I'd love to hear from Craig or Richard, perhaps both of you might have something to share about, why is it so hard for people to keep up that regular practice when they're not directly involved with the course, when they don't have that impetus of the course to keep them going?
Look, I think one of the things is that the mind is a real creature of habit. The habitual patterns of being and thinking and avoiding being present. It's so preoccupied with the past and the future that it resists in many ways being mindful. So, and that resistance, if we can just sort of work with it and just be aware that's part of the terrain, we don't have to be, I think, quite so impacted on it. One of the things that I think is important in my mind is just remembering my motivation. And that what is the cost of living an unmindful life, a life on automatic pilot, just, a slave to every thought, worry, fear, anxiety comes into my mind. I've been there, done that. I got pretty clear in my own mind that's not the life I want to live. So I just remember that there's a very clear choice, and the meditation's not always easy. There are lots of times you'd rather be doing something else, but there's a kind of lasting commitment that for myself, has come from a moment or two of real awareness in my life, and that keeps me going. I don't have to think twice about my commitment to practice meditation twice a day. It's just there. It's a non-negotiable, and I've found that there's always time if one's clear on one's own. But the mind is pretty good at finding excuses. No, I'm too tired to practice. It's like, too tired to sit down and do nothing, really? And I was like, mine's great at finding ways not to practice.
That's a great way of putting it, Craig. I like that. Just sit down and do nothing. It's definitely makes it more achievable, doesn't it? Richard, for those that are like literally just starting out with their mindfulness practice, that are quite new to it, perhaps have just done our introductory course, what would your top 3 tips be for really getting into that regular routine?
I would say start small, use support, and tie it in with an existing part of your routine. I reckon they're the top 3 things that really support it. I mean, you don't want to start with a sort of 20, 30, 45-minute practice. For most people, that's just way too much. 5 minutes, or even in our course, starting with 1 minute, we've found is really popular. Start with a comma and then slowly build it from there. So I think that's a good way to start, is just to do a manageable amount, like you do with any new skill, like with physical exercise, same thing. Then using some kind of support. So whether that's having an app, doing a course like ours, joining a group somewhere, enrolling other people, including other people so you can meditate with them, accountability buddies, anything that's going to support it, I think also really helps. But my number 1 pro tip is to tie it in with an existing part of your routine. That's I think, the thing that really seems to get the most traction for people. So, Shannon's got her 6 a.m. meditation, and so it's happening at 6 a.m. That's the time. And so if it's 6:05 and Shannon's not meditating, I guess there's probably some part of you, Shannon, that's like, whoa, I probably should be meditating by now. I do it before breakfast, whenever that tends to be, And for some people, it's before bed, or it's the middle of the day, or if they're really super busy and they're still going to work, it's turning off the car in the car park and sitting there for 5 minutes. But it's doing it at the same time consistently every day. And even if meditation seems to be too hard to do for 5 minutes at a time, or the mind's telling us we're too busy, or we actually have run out of time and we have to leave, even just sitting for 10 seconds at the same time every day, it just plants a seed and it gets a momentum going in the right direction. And that 10 seconds might be 20 seconds tomorrow, and it might be 5 minutes or 20 minutes next week. So I'd say that'd be my 3 main tips.
Thanks, Richard. That's great. So if we can commit to 10 seconds of doing nothing, that's definitely achievable. I think we can build up to a few more, a minute or 2 from there. And as you say, keep building. Starting small, I think, is really key. And those other tips you gave were great too. Shannon, coming back to you, I enjoyed that part in the film. You spoke on, it was day 38, about having this mean inner voice that was making your mindfulness practice. You used the word intolerable, which really stood out to me. But then you had one day on the plane where you experienced that deep sense of peace, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what that felt like, and was this the key thing that really kept you going at that point when things were really tough, just having that deeper experience?
So I've been writing a book which kind of expands a little bit more on my Year of Living Mindfully story, and what's been really interesting about that process is, because I'm looking back now on things that happened earlier on, I'm better able to make sense of them. And what I now realize is what actually happened on that plane is that my default mode actually got really, really, really quiet. And the default mode is, and I'm sure both Craig and Richard would be able to explain this in meditation terms far more eloquently than I can. But from my perspective, this default mode, from everything that I've read, all the scientific papers that I've pored over in my attempt to understand it, this default mode is a really important part of our well-being. This is the kind of, it automatically kicks in. It's been shown to be present even in the youngest of youngest babies. It's basically our social network in some ways. But as an adult, and for me, my default mode can actually be really nasty. And it's like, it's constantly telling me about all my missteps, all my failings, what I should and shouldn't have said in conversations, what I should and shouldn't have done in my profession. It's kind of become a bit of a ruminating network, and it's constantly with me. It serves a really important purpose because when you think about it, we're social creatures, and it means that we can get along better in the tribe, for want of a better expression. But I think what I'm understanding now is that when it comes to having an optimal default mode network, it's about the Goldilocks effect, really. You don't want too much of it, but you don't want too little of it either, because you might actually kind of fade away into nothingness. But I think what happened on that plane was that my default mode got really, really quiet. And when that happened, the boundaries between this thing that I call me and the rest of the world became quite blurred. And I was able to be really present with moment-to-moment experience. So it was like the sound of the plane, even the presence of the person sitting next to me on the flight was really... I was really aware of it, and the me, thinking just got really quiet. And it was such an important breakthrough in the Year of Living Mindfully journey, because I realized that there was this kind of alternate way of consciousness, an alternative way of being aware in the world. So it got me really curious about going forward.
So, Craig, you mentioned in the film, and I'll quote you directly, if economic affluence was a recipe for happiness, then the developed world should be as happy as it gets, but it's not. I thought that was a really powerful statement, and I was hoping you could tell us more about why so many people in wealthy nations are not always happy, and why do we have such significant rates of poor mental health?
I think one of the reasons is because a lot of people, and all of us to a greater or lesser extent, associate our happiness with economic affluence. I'll be happy if I get more or have more, and the amount that we can get, the amount that we hold on to. And there's a kind of a part of our nature which just desires to have stuff, to get stuff, to want stuff. But the unfortunate thing is we're often not curious enough to actually see, well, does that produce the happiness that we intend? Because you see, the mind, when it's in default mode, we will often notice these little dreams that we form in our mind. We see something advertised and we think, oh, there's a happy me in the future. I'll be so happy if I was driving that car, not some other car, but that car, or had that place, or was on that holiday, or lying by that pool. So all of a sudden we form this kind of very attractive dream in our head that would make me happy. And then we start getting the money, doing the stuff to get whatever it is we think will make us happy. And of course, eventually when we get to the pool and whatever, we're lying by that pool and spend a whole lot of money on it, our mind's still back at work thinking, oh, I've got so much stuff to do. So I'd be happy if I just didn't have to do this and that and the other thing. And so the mind's never actually in the moment enough to appreciate what we're experiencing, to stop the wanting and the getting. Because if we're curious, we inquire and we notice that all of that desiring, all of that wanting leads to a kind of sense of lacking and longing, a kind of sense of apprehension of being incomplete. Something wrong with me. I'm not quite okay yet. I will be if. And then when we get it, there's a kind of clinging to it and an anxiety about losing it. And when it's lost, a kind of a grief. So we're kind of getting into a cycle of longing and clinging and anxiety and grief over all sorts of things, little things and big things in our day-to-day life. I think mindfulness, and it was really telling what Shannon was saying before about all of this stuff stops. And all of a sudden, you're just all right in the moment. And it's surprising, whatever the moment's presenting, how all right we can be, even in really quite challenging moments. But we have to, in a sense, stop all of the other usual stuff. And I think mindfulness gives us a way of really being able to notice and be curious and question so many of the deeply held assumptions we have about ourselves and happiness and the world and how it's got to be, and to start to relate to ourselves and the world and everybody else the way that we are.
Yeah, it certainly does. And that reminder about how resilient we can be, like we really can overcome all sorts of adversity. But I think mindfulness really helps us with that. And obviously the film is focused on mindfulness and mental health. But Richard, I'd love to ask you, what else can the learners do outside of mindfulness to really help boost their mental health, knowing, some of the rates of mental health problems that Shannon talked about in the film? What else other than mindfulness can we be doing?
I think mindfulness is a really good part of just a healthy lifestyle, right? And there are so many other things that we know are good for both physical and mental health. I mean, sleep, of course, is one of the biggest things and one of the most undervalued things, particularly in busy Western societies. We need somewhere between, I think the evidence says, about 7 to 9 hours a night. And if we're not getting that, and if we're consistently getting 6 or less, we're just, multiple times more prone to mental health problems. So getting good quality sleep, and that's not just time lying in bed, that's time sleeping, right? And ideally lined up with circadian rhythms, so we're, not sort of reversing the sleep-wake cycle. So sleep's a big one. Exercise, moderate amounts of regular exercise. I mean, it's all the basic stuff that we know, isn't it? The diet that we have, eating well, whole foods, good balance of foods, not eating stuff that causes too much inflammation in the body. These are things that really help. Connectedness. Craig's Essence model, I think, does a really good job of laying this out, and the kind of stuff that Craig and Shannon were talking about in The Connection, in Shannon's previous documentary, really, I think, covers this so well, because there are all those basic lifestyle things that we know are really good, and I think they'd be some of the main ones. Getting out in nature, spirituality, or a connection with something bigger than us, a connection with God, or just something bigger. All of these things are very predictive of good mental health. But of course, we all kind of know that on some level, and yet they're the first things that go out the window when we're busy or stressed or unhappy in some way, which is really interesting. And I think if you look inside the brain, what tends to be happening there is when we're under stress, when we're anxious, when we're facing problems, the prefrontal cortex basically switches off, and the limbic brain, the amygdala, starts running the brain. So the problem with that is that part of our brain that helps us to monitor ourselves and plan for the future and do all the things that we know are good goes offline. And that's when, looping right back around to mindfulness, I think that's why in a lot of ways it's the foundation of living a healthy lifestyle, because no mindfulness means we're just caught up in all of those, worries and concerns, all that to-do list, and we tend to forget all of the other things that I just mentioned.
Sure. And I think sleep in particular is one that often gets compromised. Learners are worrying about things, and so they're not sleeping at night, and then they get into that vicious cycle of not getting enough sleep, and that's a real challenge. And I think some of the other things you're talking about there, particularly diet and exercise, we often think of those as being good for our physical health, but I think it's really good to remember, the mind and body are connected, so they're good for our mental health as well. So thanks for talking about that. You brought up about the brain-based changes as well. And Shannon, I love towards the end of the film when you were talking about your experience of being able to better manage emotions, difficult emotions as they come, strong emotions, that kind of corresponded with some specific changes that were seen in the brain. I would love to throw this question to any of you to talk a little bit more about these sorts of brain changes that we see from regular mindfulness practice.
Who wants to take that question? Okay, I'll jump in there and talk about my experience while making the film. One thing that I learned that was really surprising is just how little we actually do know about the brain. And I think especially when we are quite committed to mindfulness, it's really easy to run away with how much we think we know. But it's this huge, giant, it is the most complex thing in the known universe. So this is the human brain. So when I got started on my year of living mindfully, I thought that Neil Bailey, who who is one of the neuroscientists who used an EEG to measure my brain changes, I thought it was literally just going to be a matter of him sticking an EEG cap on my head and telling me whether my brain changed or not. And what I learned through my interactions with Neil is that we don't even have a neural signature using an EEG cap for something as really clear and obvious to us as depression. So he can't stick a brain cap on my head and tell me where I am on a depression scale, for example. We just don't have that information yet. We still have a lot to learn. But having said that, the other neuroscientist, Nicholas Chebuane from ANU, who studied my brain, he used an MRI and functional MRI to look at structural changes and network changes in my brain. And he was a really interesting person because he's studying healthy brain aging. He's really interested in how we can prevent things like Alzheimer's disease and dementia and other illnesses of aging. And he started the project saying he didn't think that we were going to see anything. And he was like, look, I'm happy to participate and good on you for being a health journalist and, let's just do this for fun. And by the end of the project, he was flipping the questions on me and asking me more about my retreat and how did I find time to meditate. And because he was really, he was convinced by the changes that he saw, and he was happy with the way that we'd conducted the experiment to attribute those changes to my daily practice. So there's definitely a there, but I also think that we need to be a little bit careful in kind of overselling this. There's still a lot to learn.
Yeah, I think that's so true. The brain is so complex. I love that you were kind of illuminating things for the brain researcher there as well. I think that's gorgeous. But just, talking with my daughter the other day, she was reading a book about the development of computers, and they were talking about the number of connections in a computer and then how many are in your brain. And it just totally opened her, which, wow, the brain is so amazing. We talked about just how amazing it is. It was really quite fascinating. Craig, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, because I know the research presented in our Future Learn courses about the brain changes are particularly motivating for a lot of our learners. Is there anything else you might like to add about that?
Yeah, well, I think there are two main different ways of studying this. And so when we study it scientifically from the outside in, somebody put something on the skull, MRI, you kind of look from the outside in, but the way we study it from an experiential point of view is from the inside out. And it's really interesting when those things, merge together. Things like fear of public speaking and all of the kind of stuff, I can experience for myself. And I didn't know much about the brain, but I just knew anybody put me in a situation where I'd stand up in front of a group of people and bang, the amygdala would be firing off like crazy and everything else. And I realized I had to practice staying present, not getting ahead of myself, hoping it's going to be all right, and what if it's not, and everything else. So I used to practice a lot of being present. I used to practice a lot of just feeling comfortable with uncomfortable emotions. I mean, this is before I, teaching mindfulness or anything else, just sort of intuitively working with it myself. So to feel comfortable with uncomfortable emotions, to be less reactive to it. And so all of that kind of stuff, practicing. And now when I see research, the amygdala quietens down and it gets less reactive, and Herbert Benson and his team at Harvard doing research to show that those stress genes just quieten down, I can say, oh, yeah, I know what that feels like, because that's what it feels like from the inside out. And for me, ultimately, that's the most important evidence, because as much as we like to think about it, and I think we have this sort of fine line between respect for science and what it can show, but there's a whole thing about, well, what sort of research is being funded? What do the researchers understand? How far can we go? How can we measure things? There's so much that science finds it difficult to measure. And yet, for thousands of years, the direct experiential insights into mindfulness have come from that inner learning. And those two need to go together. Because if the science is showing something that people have said for a long time doesn't work, then we've really got to stop and say, whoa. Maybe we're working on the wrong assumptions there. But I think it's best of all when the science is there and the inner experience is there and each informs the other. Then for me, it gets really interesting. And for people that just look at it scientifically but not experientially will never understand what mindfulness is about. And people are just the experience, but without any way of sort of trying to validate the findings. You know, if there wasn't for the modern science and some really cluey people doing some great work, then it wouldn't have found the audience that it's finding now. So I think each needs the other. But it's just fascinating to see how far this goes, and in many ways what it confirms people have known about for a very long time.
Sure, and it's definitely something I'm often emphasising in the course to the learners, sort of when they're asking for more information and where can I learn about this, it's kind of like learning more is great, but practicing is where you're really going to experience it. So, and I think that kind of came through in Shannon. I feel your final conclusion when you're looking at your subjective well-being, how that significantly improved, and that really was kind of the most important thing. If you're feeling better in yourself, regardless of if it's switching genes on or off or changing things in the brain, I think that's kind of key.
You know, it's so funny you say that because the subjective well-being survey that I filled out for Kamina Lyle to be able to measure if my subjective well-being changed, I filled that in as an afterthought. At the beginning of the experiment, I was like, oh, you know, subjective well-being, you know, that's not a hard measurement. And by the end of the project, it was the only thing actually that mattered to me, because I realized just how hard it is to do very precise science and just how far we've got to go in being able to study this, and how mindfulness affects individual people. Because, you know, the good science is looking at, you know, cohorts of people, large groups of people, but it's really difficult to know how mindfulness is going to affect one particular individual person. And so by the end of the project, the subjective well-being was the thing that I cared most about, which was actually really surprising.
And it improved so much. Like, it was about 20 points, wasn't it? It was 70 something to 90 something. It was a really significant increase. So that was great to see. And I'm aware we have time for one final question. And I would like to ask you, Shannon, your previous film, The Connection, and your book, The Whole Health Life, I think all beautifully bring to life the power of the mind-body connection. I'm sure learners will be wondering, are you working on another project? And is there something perhaps you can tell us about that at this stage?
You bet. Having said that, independent filmmaking, which is what I do, is really difficult to do. Jules and I finance our films ourselves and get a little bit of grant money to help us along the way. Our dream is actually to continue making these films. I think people are really hungry for information that they can trust. I think that there's a big wellness industry that is making an awful lot of money out of people who are searching for answers. And I hope in the future that we can continue making these kind of films that provide trustworthy answers that people are looking for. So the answer is yes, we are absolutely working on new projects, and we're interested in several topics, including how to make lasting healthy behaviour change. Yeah. Yes,
Thank
so
you.
stay
That
tuned.
sounds exciting. I look forward to finding out more in due course when you're ready to tell us more. And I'd really like to thank you and Craig and Richard for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And of course, I'd like to thank everyone who's chosen and spent some time to watch this Q&A session. We hope it's been helpful for you in answering some questions that you may have had. And I'd also like to just remind people, if you'd like to know more about the film, you can go to the website www.myyearoflivingmindfully.com. And you could also explore the courses on FutureLearn. The first one is Mindfulness for Wellbeing and Peak Performance, and then we have an extension course, Maintaining a Mindful Life. So thank you. We hope this session has helped inspire you to keep exploring mindfulness in whatever way feels right for you, because it really is the individual journey that is most important. So thank you and good luck.